All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to From Pillar to Post. I have to remind you guys, the TVMA symbol is up on the top left-hand corner of your screen here on YouTube because of the FTC and COPPA. And you'll see the TrumpMania book cover and a picture of our next guest here. It's Lavie Margolin coming back to the show. Thank you, Lavie. How are you?
I'm great. It's great. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming back here. Let's talk about the book. Right after you were kind enough to get me a review copy, and I appreciate that. And everybody who wants to hear about TrumpMania can go back to our interview from about 2 years ago. And I'm assuming that the book did well. You said something off air about a press release, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the how the book did? And it's gotten a lot of positive reviews from what I saw on Amazon, and just give us a little bit about how the book did and how are things going forward with it.
Yes, it's actually been a really fun journey for the book in itself. It reached as far as #2 on Amazon. There was a miscategorized keto diet book, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I was complaining online about that the book shouldn't be in the category so I can be #1. But the book's reached far and wide, and it's been a great opportunity also to connect with the wrestling community. It helped to hook me in further to Twitter, where I'm a regular several times a day now. And most interestingly and surprisingly, a few months into the book's publication, Hollywood reached out, and I'm working with a great team called the Main Event Media, which is part of All Three Media Communications, and they're turning the TrumpMania book into a podcast.
Nice. When you say TrumpMania into a podcast, how can you divulge a little bit of the logistics as far as how do you turn a book into a podcast, and especially how do you go week on week talking about the correlation between Vince McMahon and Donald Trump? I mean, is that what the podcast is going to be about?
So it'll be a book inspires the topics of the podcast. There will be hosts of the podcast, not myself. And they're going to go through some of the major topics that are in the book to talk about how the McMahons and Trump have a 30-year plus relationship, to walk through that from WrestleMania 4 and 5 and so on, but also to look at it from a political perspective, how Trump's time in the WWF and WWE helped to inspire some of his political strategies and led him to success to become the 45th president of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to really get into much personal politics here, but every time the man opens his mouth nowadays, especially, I mean, with the impeachment and everything going on, it's almost as if he's out there cutting promos, is it not?
Oh, yes. He's definitely talking to his audience. And John Cena wouldn't enjoy this comparison from what I'm catching on Twitter. But I would say if trying to understand from a pro wrestling perspective, right, there's always been an audience that's cheered Cena and one that's booed him. So with Trump, it's clearly defined that one part of the audience will enjoy hearing from him and one will hate him.
It sounds very much like when you describe the podcast. I'm a big fan of NPR. I'm a 35-year-old man. My wife calls me the grumpy old man because when I get in the car, I'm either listening to podcasts, listening to classic rock music, or listening to NPR. Is the Trump? I'm going to call it the TrumpMania podcast for now. Is it going to be like an NPR style podcast, or is it going to be like kind of what you would hear? Like, a normal podcast where it's just a bunch of guys sitting around shooting the shit, so to speak.
I would say it's a great point about NPR. I listen to it a lot as well. Besides great podcasts or shows like your own, I've actually started leaning a little bit closer to listening to NPR, a little bit away from wrestling, which has surprised me recently. So that will definitely be a core of it, but it'll also have humor infused in it, which I think is important even when dealing with a really serious topic.
See, I'm a huge NPR fan. I get on there and listen to Morning Edition on the way to work, and And me and the wife just yesterday were listening to Wait Wait Don't Tell Me. So I mean, it's NPR is like kind of taken over my life here in the last few months, especially since I've gotten a job, driving again. So it's nice to see a kind of I guess you would call it a wrestling based podcast or a Politico wrestling based podcast. I'm not even sure how to describe it. It's so unique that kind of takes that kind of turn, and I think we need more of that. I remember when John Philip Havage was doing his CWF Mid Atlantic Wrestling podcast, which I wish would come back, but that was kind of like a NPR style, all things considered type of show. So it's nice to see more stuff that is talking about wrestling presented in that style. That's not just people sitting around bashing the business for an hour straight.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that, right, you either have that or you have sort of like the rah-rahs of promoting, one promotion over another. And I could get into that sort of as a teenager, but now I guess, like you're saying, feeling like an older person, one corporation against another, I really can't cheer for one side or another. So it's more fun to go in depth and really enjoy the business from that perspective.
I guess this kind of leads me into my next topic, but I missed the oh man, I can't remember the name of the guy who does it, but he's at Pro Wrestling on Twitter. He did the Talking Sheet podcast, where it was a little bit of a bunch of guys sitting around BSing, and then it was also kind of NPR style talking about the people who talk about the business, like the Meltzers and stuff. And I really missed that show. But I'm hoping that, can you give us an idea of when the first episode's going to drop, who's going to host it, when, anything like that?
Sure. That's to be announced. So Main Event Media will provide that information, but certainly in a topic like this, I would imagine, it'll be timely. So, as we lead up to the 2020 elections, I think I would imagine that would be an important time to put something like this out. But Main Event Media will have to release the official dates and information.
Cool. We'll look forward to that. And we'll also go ahead and put a link down to the Amazon listing for TrumpMania here. I'm guessing the podcast doesn't have like a feed or anything like that people can subscribe to or anything yet, but we'll be sure to retweet. And I know you're going to tweet it out. We'll retweet that and everything once that gets announced and going. But speaking of Twitter, your Twitter has very much interested me over the course of the last couple of years since TrumpMania has come out. You said that it kind of has thrusted you into the limelight, so to speak, as far as the online wrestling community. Did you expect that kind of Did you kind of expect to be thrust into that area and thrusted into that light when you wrote the book?
It's actually amazing because there was this whole Twitter community going on that I had no idea really existed, which sounds pretty funny. But, I had been on Twitter. Besides being a lifelong pro wrestling fan, my career base is bent more towards like interviewing advice and like career guidance, those sort of things. So I had been on Twitter for that, but I never really followed wrestling discussion until I was nearly done with the book and thought it'd be a good way to connect with people and get the word out there and find like-minded people. And once I started engaging in that, I found it to be a really positive community if you point yourself in the right direction, meaning that some people are there just to argue or are big fans of certain people or promotions, and you can really go down that rabbit hole. But for me, I just follow about 100 people, maybe like 105 people at the moment, including yourself. And we're people that really like to enjoy the business from a sort of in-depth perspective or from a business perspective. And with those people, it's a great way to connect. And what I found is that when you're a genuine person and approaching people like that and sharing information, they're glad to help you. So that's really helped the book to reach wide, even including a really nice guy who had written an article focusing on TrumpMania for the Sydney Morning Herald. So I guess in Australia, one Sunday morning, I was of note. I'm not sure how much it would cost to ship the book to Australia, but I think people were reading about it and interested. So you never know how far these things will reach.
Speaking of the book again, I mean, I don't mean to. I have a lot of modern day things I want to talk to you about, but the aftermath of the book really intrigues me because I loved the book, especially those two chapters or those few chapters talking about those back-to-back WrestleManias. Really, really was awesome. But it's kind of an epilogue, if you will, within the last. I want to say the last year. I don't follow politics all that much, but I know that Linda McMahon is no longer in charge of the Small Business Administration. She's kind of taken a lesser role when it comes there, but she's still around. I'm guessing what this leads me to is there going to be an epilogue once this man finally gets out of office?
So actually, really interestingly, Linda McMahon, that's correct that she's no longer part of the administration, but her role right now is more key to helping Trump than it's ever been. So she runs the biggest fundraising arm that supports Trump. Like I think you would define it as a super PAC, which is America Action First. So there was a dinner recently in New York where I think they raised $4 million, and the day after Trump's impeachment was announced, $1 million was raised.
Jesus.
So make of that what you will. But interestingly, Linda McMahon has survived as somebody that hasn't been tarnished by Trump. For some reason, these relationships keep ending on a sour note, even from an apolitical perspective. But for them, their relationship has only gotten stronger. But will Trump become more involved in wrestling in the future? Well, interestingly, with sports, that's been seen as a tool to help get Trump over. To use a wrestling term, right? He was at the University of Alabama game, although I think it was the first home game they had lost in many years, from my understanding. He's been pointing himself towards events where it seems like he would get support. At the UFC, Colby Covington was fighting his biggest supporter in the UFC, or at least the most popular supporter of his. And there was controversy whether he was cheered or booed. It seemed like a mix of both. So if he were to attend UFC, why not, from his perspective, WWE, although they're more cautious about that of how it could alienate his fans. But I think at some point there'll be some crossover again.
I was going to say that Alabama game, if I remember correctly, and it's the South. I'm from the South. I grew up in the South, hence the stupid Southern accent. But I think that Alabama game was the first one where he got cheered and didn't get overly booed. He went to the World Series and got trashed. I mean, trashed when he went to the World Series. But, and you mentioned sports and him going to WWE. He's a WWE Hall of Famer. I personally, I think it's a good thing that he has been nowhere near the product, because the ratings are bad enough as it is, and the criticism of the product is bad enough as it is. The crazy part, though, is as bad as it would be for the company and as bad as it would be for the business, from a fan's point of view, the revenue has never been higher for the company. So I don't know if that would help. I don't know if him coming to the company, or coming to any event, would hurt or help at this point, as far from a WWE perspective.
No, that's a good point, because the biggest revenue drivers right now are television rights, and those are locked in for the next 5 years.
Yep.
And interestingly, one of the next biggest revenue drivers after that is their deal with Saudi Arabia in their Saudi Arabia's Vision 2020 initiative. I might be mixing up the years, but so that that's been the WWE's political controversy when they've avoided it with Trump. But it would probably be up to their television sponsors, whether it's Universal, which, based on their programming and their news, would probably tend to lean more liberally, and Fox, of course, where we know that the narrative is that it's far more conservative. So I hadn't even thought about that, but you have those two polar opposite important forces of their television distribution that probably play a pretty heavy role of dictating what they're going to do, just based on the importance of them to the company.
So I guess my final question about the book is, I mentioned like a little epilogue here. Once Trump is out of office and once, everything is, all the dust has settled, do you plan on re-releasing this book with a little bit of an epilogue thrown in there? Because I think it would be quite interesting.
So that's a great question, and it's something that I've thought about because even, the book came out a year after Trump was elected, and of course it takes a few months prior to publication to sort of finalize things. So in that time, things have just steamed forward so much that there's a lot of content there in itself. There's some things that I've thought about more of the narrative to include going backwards. It's something I'm definitely open to. I think it would depend on market demands, perhaps depending on the popularity of the forthcoming podcast and perhaps other publishers' interest. That's something that I'm open to. I'd love to do it if the market was right. If things remain the same, I think the audience that I reached has probably been reached. But if it can sort of expand out further, then I'd love to do it.
I think you re-release it the same day Trump releases his book about the whole ordeal, because he's going to write one, or he's going to have somebody write one for him.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be a really good idea. I love. Actually, it's great on Amazon. You could advertise to people that are on the page of books that you think would be a fit for you. So one of the ads that I've been paying for is on Mayor Kane's forthcoming book that's coming out next week, or maybe even this week.
Very nice. Very cool. I like how you could cater your advertising nowadays. It used to be, you used to have to pay thousands of dollars for just a minute of ad time. Now you can, I'm constantly sitting there going, you can get this tweet boosted and reach 3,000 more people for $15. So it's interesting how they will cater advertising to just regular Joes like me, pun intended. Let's talk about some Ring of Honor. I through your Twitter, I've gotten to know, and I love how you pick apart Ring of Honor's business dealings, from the Sinclair WGN deal, which I wanted to go through, but the Tribune deal, that I'm guessing that the FCC found that, or the federal government found that they were going to be a monopoly if that went through, and now they've bought in all these Fox stations from Fox, these satellite sports stations. Have you always followed Ring of Honor this closely? Because once I started following you on Twitter, and then the book came out, it was maybe about 6 months after the book came out, I think, that you started really especially around that time of the WGN, the Tribune deal. Have you always followed Ring of Honor this closely?
So that's a great question. No, but probably around that same timeline. Full disclosure, I am a Sinclair shareholder, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. So that has definitely played into an interest, although Ring of Honor plays a very small part, from what I understand, in their revenue.
Yeah.
One of the things that really inspired me to dig deeper was especially engaging in the world of Twitter, seeing the WrestleNomics guys really dig deep into business. And I realized not only can this come from sort of the most well-known newsletters or websites, but if you work hard enough and are committed to it, you could really make an impact too. So that sort of inspired me to dig deeper. One of the first things that I did ambitiously was to say, let me see if I can get a complete record of Ring of Honor's attendance history, which I pretty much did, thankfully, which then every time I publish a subsequent report, I have the previous years to look back on. But one of the things that helped was to start setting up Google News alerts. So I have a variety of them related to Sinclair and Ring of Honor. So it allows me, the first time that there's a seemingly credible rumor circulating that they're going to bid on Fox or what's going on with WGN, I'm able to dig deeper into it, and allowed me to learn more about their business.
Let me ask you, with you being a shareholder in the company, and I don't mean to get into a man's personal financials, so you can answer this yes, no, whatever. Have you attended any shareholder meetings or conference calls, and have you asked them directly any questions about Ring of Honor?
That's a great question. So I haven't attended any meetings in person, but I'm probably one of the few people that follows pro wrestling very closely, that listens live as much as possible to their quarterly conference calls, and I'm always listening to see if there will be any mention or questions about Ring of Honor. So I'm quick to share that. It's often, if it's one piece that's shared, then it's a lot. Two things that come to mind are one was sort of glowing about the Madison Square Garden sellout, which we can talk about, which seems like a million years ago, even though it was only April. And the second piece was a question from a financial analyst related to the company strategy regarding sports and the Fox RSN acquisition and how that plays into Ring of Honor and the other properties that they have.
Yeah, because I have a Sinclair station where I'm at. I have WSET, which is an ABC affiliate. They're based in Roanoke, but they have an office here in Danville, Virginia, where I'm from. And they are constantly showing Ring of Honor. And if you don't get it there, it's on the Stadium Network, or they're showing it on the Planet channel for a while. You know, these little what I call satellite HD stations that have popped up that show Golden Girls or Star Trek all day. They show Ring of Honor as well. So it's exciting from a fan standpoint. I know I'm sure it has to be exciting for you that ROH is coming to these little satellite sports networks. The problem I have, and the question I have for you is, do you think that they're going to be relegated to that 2 a.m. time slot that they're almost always are on as far as Sinclair stations go? They show it Saturday mornings here, but Saturday mornings around here, people are up and doing stuff. You know, the Saturday morning cartoon wrestling audience is gone, you know? So do you think that with these stations, Ring of Honor is going to be relegated to the, you know, the hours of where they're pushing George Foreman grills and all that?
So from my understanding, what I've read, that for the affiliates, like you mentioned, the ABC, NBC, Fox type affiliates that they own, it's must-run programming. So Sinclair corporate dictates, here's Ring of Honor, you must show it. You know, you can show it as much as you want, but you have to show it, put it wherever you want. So I think it's a station manager's discretion, sort of where it goes. I have seen one potential bump for it would be Sinclair does own a number of Fox stations. So on Twitter, there are people documenting, hey, you know, I'm seeing a Ring of Honor ad during Friday night SmackDown. So that's one plus. I know that with their acquisition of the Fox RSNs, which I believe was 23 markets, that it's running, I think, something like Friday at midnight at a set time, which, although that sounds disappointing, you have to remember that if you put it in prime time, then for each station, depending on the local sports teams, it would be preempted all the time, whether it's hockey or baseball or basketball and so on. So, and then there's also the, as you mentioned, the multicast networks, which for those that aren't familiar, if you don't have cable and you have an antenna, let's say here in New York, NBC runs on channel 4, but they also have bandwidth to have a 4.2, 4.3, 4.4. So depending on the market and the station, some of them utilize that bandwidth to pick up Comet or Charge or you know, those right. Me TV, those type of networks, some of which are owned by Sinclair that put it on. So I think from Sinclair's perspective, it's cheap programming that can be placed anywhere, and I don't see that investment of putting it in prime time unless they acquire a long-rumored cable station where wrestling would have some connection to it, where you run it in a more dedicated time slot. I think if they could figure out a way to put it on the Tennis Channel, they would, but it just doesn't make sense. I remember a Joe Koff interview where he talked about that I think Ring of Honor gets to keep 2 ads, something like 30 seconds or a minute of advertising, so that's their revenue. They don't get, I assume their production fees are paid for, I'm not sure, but the revenue that they get is a little cut of the advertising. So as Sinclair acquires more and more stations, you could see the value of Ring of Honor growing incrementally, at least from that perspective.
They also acquired the Yes Network, which is where, Mike and the Mad Dog would broadcast at for many, many years. It's a huge sports station up in the Northeast. For a while, and go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, that once that goes through, if Ring of Honor airs on there, that'll be pretty significant, especially for the tri-state area, because right now, I believe if it's a clear day and you point your antenna in the right direction, you might be able to pick up Stadium, but besides something like that, there's really no presence for Ring of Honor at all. So something like that would be pretty significant for them from a local level.
You just answered my next question, because I was going to be, does this mean that one of Ring of Honor's biggest markets from I won't say live attendance perspective, because it's gone down in recent years, I think, but they run Final Battle in New York just about every year. They were running it every year at the Hammerstein, and New York is a hotbed for wrestling in general, but they had no TV there. It's like they couldn't follow the week-to-week TV unless they caught it online or downloaded it through various means. But I'm hoping that this will finally give them a bump for New York, and that New York will finally get the TV every week.
Yeah, it would definitely be a significant visibility key, because they're not really in the major markets. It'll be interesting to see what they do with their Cubs affiliation as well. I forgot what that new station will be called, but that's the number 1 New York and number 3 market Chicago. So that could be pretty significant for them. But interestingly, I think the way wrestling has been promoted in the past versus where it's going now, if we look at an AEW, they were doing great without any television. Sort of, there was that buzz and curiosity, and now that they're on television, I won't say that it hurt them, but it just, once it became more of a regular thing, that it just tours around everywhere eventually. So week to week, the attendance is now closer to 4 and sometimes 6,000, whereas the first few shows, which were higher profile, was like immediate sellout.
We'll get to the attendance and building issues. I can't believe it's already been a half an hour with us here. You're listening to From Pillow to Post, author and famous wrestling Twitter personality Lavie Margolin joins us here. I really want to get to the recent stuff that has happened with Joey Mercury and Kelly Klein, but I want to talk to you more about this Sinclair deal here. I know it, but I know the reasoning why. It's because it's a region. What this deal is regional. It's regional sports networks. Not everybody can get Fox Sports South, which sucks for me because I live in the South. I'm an Atlanta Braves fan, and I think they hold the rights to the Braves now. But they weren't able to get their hands on one station in the Tribune deal, because I'm assuming that the Tribune deal was only for WGN and not the Chicago Tribune paper and all that. But I find it funny how the federal government says you can't have WGN, which, let's face it, is not a top channel like it used to be. Back in like the early 90s and late 80s, when cable was just starting to come around, it was the only superstation besides Turner. You can't have one. In recent years, it's really, really fallen. I mean, once they lost Bozo's Super Sunday show, it went to pot. Let's be clear. But I think that you can't have one station that's kind of low tier and you have to go into the 900s on Comcast to find it on the guide. But we'll let you have 21 regional sports stations, which when you compare it, I would say that's the same amount of reach, but maybe not the same amount of money. Can you give us some insight onto maybe why the government said, okay, you have 21 regional sports stations, but you can't have WGN because that's a monopoly?
So, right. So the key really with the deal with Tribune was the over-the-air broadcast stations and the cap on the reach. It's sort of for some people they consider an outdated rule with how much media can control a percentage of the country. So the regulators, from my understanding, they didn't outright rule it out, but they came to Sinclair and they said, listen, as it's structured now, this isn't going to work. You're going to have to sell out X percentage to be under the cap. So Sinclair was sort of, I would define it without knowing, as kind of cocky about it. And they tried something which they already do, and from my understanding is somewhat standard in the industry, which is to run railroad corporations or sidecar corporations, meaning that you have your corporation and then you sort of set up a shell corporation, for lack of a better word, which you totally control and is obviously yours, but you say, well, no, that's not our company, that's someone else's company. So it might be like the mother-in-law of Sinclair's CEO, or it'll be a car dealer in Baltimore who's obviously tied to Sinclair, and these are just examples. And then Sinclair will sort of sell it to this company for a very small amount of dollars, but then totally control the station. So it's sort of like improving their reach. So when there was pushback on this, it was almost gave the government regulators no choice but to say no.
So they tried that railroading technique where they kind of were like, okay, it's not my company, it's my mother-in-law's company, and the government looked at them and said, "Nah, you're not going to sneak in the back door that way." Is that what happened?
Right, exactly. So instead of like, let's say the cap is 35%, and if they kept these railroads, it would be 40-something%. So instead of going down to 30 to be safe, they tried to keep all of it, and it was just like too much in the face of regulations, even if you had Trump's support to move forward with. And we can, depending on your perspective of Sinclair and the way they do news, with some of their other must-run programming, some people could really understand the concern of a broadcaster like this having too much control, because if it seems like you're not apolitical and you're pushing one message and there's not another message getting out there, it could be really a dangerous thing, even if, there's so many other ways to acquire news right now, over the internet.
Let's talk a little bit about the modern day, more recent stuff. Well, kind of recent here, getting away from the business aspect of it and getting into more like the day-to-day operations, if that makes any sense, and the overall popularity of the company. Before AEW came around, and before Cody came around, and before, the Bucks were going back and forth between Japan and Ring of Honor. They were under Ring of Honor contracts, but they were allowed to primarily, work in Japan and everything like that. And then they would come over here for like the big shows, so to speak, for Ring of Honor. From your perspective, did you see when the Bucks and then Cody comes in and Cody immediately latches himself onto the Bucks? Did you see it spinning out of control for Ring of Honor the way it has in the last couple of years for them from a popularity standpoint? Because that company, Ring of Honor, was red freaking hot, man. They had Adam Cole. You had that almost year-long run with Jay Lethal in 2015, 2016. They were firing on all cylinders, it seemed, and then Cody leaves. The Bucks leave. Japan becomes more prominent. It's kind of like Japan overshadowed Ring of Honor in a big way when Ring of Honor was primarily the ones responsible for introducing the Japanese talent to the American audience and getting the attention on New Japan. what are your thoughts on all of that? And it's kind of the bottom has fallen out, so to speak, now.
So, interestingly, what really brought me back to pro wrestling was Ring of Honor, even to give a longer perspective. So, by 2001, I was kind of tiring of, once the WWF, CW wrestling war was over and the WWE, I guess by that time, they were still doing Katie Vick angles and that sort of thing. So I was like, I've been a huge fan, but I'm just done with this. And then I would still get the newsletters, and they'd be like, Ring of Honor, it's amazing. And when there was bus trips from New York to go see Ring of Honor in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I was hooked since then. But looking at it sort of from a long-term perspective, there was this peak of Bryan Danielson and Samoa Joe and CM Punk through 2007 and so on. And you can see through 2008 or 2009, like business was very hot. And then it started going downhill. Even when Sinclair brought it, it went down further. And it didn't pick back up till a few years after they owned it, some of the names that you mentioned. And I think it started getting really hot as a business around 2017 when AJ Styles became more of a regular, because he came in with a name from Ring of Honor, but also was coming off a TNA run when TNA was drawing, I think, like 1.5 million people weekly. The Young Bucks, they kept picking up momentum, and the company was growing and growing. Where I saw it actually dip off was WrestleMania weekend 2018. After that show in Louisiana, the attendance started dipping. And I think it got worse for me, sort of in looking at the business after All In. I think All In was sort of something that showed that you may have your alternative brand, but the business can really look at sort of like a secondary major brand. And it really hurt some of these other companies. And when Cody and the Young Bucks and et cetera left, it really accelerated things. And then the creative this year was so poor, leading into the WrestleMania weekend show, where I happened to have been there live. Just the historic nature of being a New York fan that loves Madison Square Garden and the history of it, that after that and Taven was given the title, it just like bottomed out. It was like horrible attendances. So it was, I think it is partially due to AEW and partially due to those talents leaving, but things were already trending down, and a lot of the creative decisions that the company made were shooting themselves in the foot. And now, as you mentioned, with Joey Mercury on Twitter, we're seeing that forward-facing it was bad, but behind the scenes it might even be worse.
It's been bad for many years. And you talk about when Sinclair first bought the company, I have to mention this guy's name. I know he's not probably popular with you, and I know he's not popular with a lot of people, but Jim Cornette. The rat was already off the damn ship, Lavie, when this man quit the company. Would you say that he's sitting there up there in Castle Cornet in Kentucky, telling, he mentioned it, I think, a couple weeks ago on his podcast. He basically gave the entire Ring of Honor fan base and anybody who follows that company a big fat I told you so. And would you have to agree with that he told us, Greg Gilliland and everybody up there, the office boy, he's going to ruin it, and he drove me away. Would you think that Jim Cornette's right in giving everybody that I told you so?
Well, he definitely gave us some perspective for what was going on. I think, Jim Cornette, it's a complicated story. He's positioned himself in many different ways over the years. I would say most recently, but up to 2 weeks ago, he took on the role of sort of like a non-traditional liberal leader, sort of for the rest of the community, where he would sort of rail against Trump and one of the things you'd imagine as somebody from that perspective, if you were to think of like a Democrat or liberal person, would be somebody that would be, very respectful of minority groups and such. But we were, for people that sort of bought into that, you would have to forget, the past, where, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, which I'd be curious to learn if that was a regular stop near you, or if you received that on local television. A lot of it was race baiting, and I hate to say it because I love that promotion, and there's a well-documented race riot where Cornette was written as having used the N-word, and so his where one attaches themselves to him, it could vary, but I think when discussing wrestling business, he has a very long-term perspective, and when he says something is an issue, it's something certainly not to be ignored. And when he talked about some of the things that were wrong in Ring of Honor, it could have been covered over because of getting the right talents, but it always seemed like Ring of Honor was succeeding despite itself, because look, you had these red hot talents that are now drawing several thousand, and whatever Ring of Honor was doing with them, okay, you averaged 1,100, which was much better than you had been doing, but look at the missed opportunities.
I think that when you talk about Cornette, and it kind of parallels itself, because this Newsweek article that I read, it talks about how, when talents get hurt, the office isn't there, and in that interview that Cornette did with Sean Oliver for the kayfabe commentary, it was for kayfabe commentaries, he mentioned that night up there in Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania, when Steve Corino fell on that guardrail, or got suplexed onto that guardrail, and a lot of people that night were worried. I remember Twitter that night blew up. A lot of people were worried for Steve Corino that night. Greg Gilliland wasn't there. Joe Koff wasn't there. No, Gary Jester wasn't there. Nobody was there. So he had to kind of be in charge of the company. And that's what kind of led to him blowing up at Greg Gilliland, who he called the office boy. And in that interview, I think he mentions Greg Gilliland once in that interview. He didn't really want to mention him by name. I think he just kind of said, screw it, let's say it. But here we are, so many moons later, years later, and it's still happening behind the scenes. And the word was that, in this Newsweek article, it says, quite frankly, that, the boys, or Joe Koff, just keeps Greg Gilliland around. Do you think that this is going to lead to Greg Gilliland's departure from the company, or should it lead to Greg Gilliland's departure from the company?
It's interesting because some of it is really shocking to me that it's been allowed to happen, and that Gilliland would have put some of these things in writing, because Koff, for better or worse, seems like the ultimate company man. Whenever he gives interviews, he's very along the line, and he's been a Sinclair executive years and years before any involvement with wrestling, although sometimes he ties himself to a live special in the 80s, that Sinclair sort of was involved in, but just being a Sinclair executive. So I think he's probably thinking about it long and hard, sort of the best way to get out of this, whether that's being forced to have somebody like Gilliland move along, or if they find it less than credible and they're going to go with Gilliland, to start sending out letters that say, you have to stop this public discussion of this, or you're in violation of XYZ, because I can't imagine the company just allowing people to spread information about them without sort of striking back from a legal perspective, although it seems pretty clear that happened as they did, the way people are sharing it.
Kelly Klein, who this Newsweek article is primarily based around, gets a concussion, There's no medical. So she says there's no medical staff on site, which I tend to believe 7 people over the word of 2. There's no medical staff on site. There's nobody evaluating these guys. There's no concussion protocol. Sounds like there's not barely even a wellness policy. If you say that, I mean that's what my take. Then there's this thing, the women's revolution is happening, and women's wrestling is taking a prominent point in wrestling. I mean, look at War Games last night with the women in WWE, and then we got Survivor Series matches, and Ronda Rousey, and the rise of Becky Lynch, and then New Japan, the company New Japan has bought Stardom over there, so they're trying to get that going. And everybody has said Ring of Honor needs a women's division. They've tried to give us a women's division, and it has not taken off. I mean, quite frankly, it's almost non-existent. And now, do you think that we kind of know why that it's non-existent and why it hasn't been pushed the way it needed to be? When you see in this Newsweek article this text between Joey Mercury and Joe Koff, where he's like, they're not going to make us millions, and he says Maria won't make us millions. But I have to think that, and what I got out of this, and I want your opinion on this as well. My opinion, when I read this text message, now granted, people who are listening, you can only go from the context of this one text message. It may not tell you the rest of what Greg Gilliland and the people at Ring of Honor feel. But from the context of this text message, I basically get the feeling that Greg Gilliland doesn't think women draw in general. Would you say that's the case from this?
It definitely seems like they're not if they don't believe in an idea, they're not going to invest enough time to try and make it work. I remember for years it seemed like a women's division in Ring of Honor would be a good idea before WWE Women's Revolution, because you needed something that would distinguish yourself from the competition, especially if you're a smaller competitor. And, they would have matches from time to time. It would be, okay, let's get a belt going, let's get a division going. And it always seemed like later. And it's really interesting that it's Kelly Klein that's had these issues, because the fact that she didn't win the belt when it was the finals made no sense. It was, I mean, not to shade Sumi Sakai at all. She seems like she really loves this business and has worked so hard for it. But it was so clear that it should be Kelly Klein that it made no sense that she didn't get the belt originally. And it was terrible to read at least what was being shared, that she was making $20,000 under an exclusive deal, although she can spend other time in other promotions as long as it wasn't, the direct competitors, and try and argue for $24,000, being told no. And if you look at her background, I remember, like I mentioned, I have Google alerts, so I had gotten an article about her from her alma mater. I believe that she was a music major in college, so she's a very intelligent person. And it's terrible, to have to undergo these circumstances, and really a loss for the company, because she's very marketable, and hopefully her health will be such that she can attach herself to another company. And if she's in an AEW, I think she'd really excel.
Another woman that is crazy, because this text was about Maria Manic, and I've seen Maria Manic in person. I've sat front row for her matches, some of her matches in Queens of Combat. This woman is built, excuse the language here, she's built like a brick, you know what, man. See, folks, I can stop myself from cursing. But this woman is beautiful. She's built, strong, she's got personality. And now in this text message, you're saying, oh, she's not going to make us millions. My question, my original thought, and maybe you had this thing too, is nobody in this freaking company, the way you're running it, is making you millions. The attendance figures are dropping. You're running big buildings that completely looked wiped out. I mean, am I wrong for thinking this? It's like nobody's drawing you millions right now.
Yeah, they've really... I've been really thinking about it. I'm like, what company has gone downhill so quickly that they're in this position now? may think about WWF with the steroid and other scandals in the early 90s, how their business dropped. The AWA losing talent, TNA, at different points. But I don't know if percentage-wise it was so sudden and so decisive that you turned from a popular alternative brand to a company that people look at in a negative way, and where, like, if you were to take those talents and to sort of promote them under another banner, let's say, just pulling something out of the air, like a GCW, which is sort of like is a buzzworthy independent, and you were to take like a PCO and a Marty Skrull and say they're in the main event, and you'd come to town, I feel like you would draw better. But being under the Ring of Honor banner, it's this huge negative right now.
Some of the things that kind of intrigued me, I'm sitting here on Joey Mercury's Twitter, and I have 4 tabs open on my browser right here that I wanted to talk to you about. We're probably not going to get to all of them here as the hour's winding down, but one of them was the Enzo Amore big cast deal that now is pretty clear that Ring of Honor knew about. I mean, I think it was clear before, but this kind of makes it concrete. And one of the things that he has circled here is, they need credentials, and you're on the list. What time are they coming in? We need to have a meeting with these guys beforehand. And everybody's like, Joe and interested parties can know. And Greg goes, Joe doesn't know. And he has, Mercury has circled that. And one of the things that kills me is that really didn't strike me as something huge, because there's a lot of things that go on in WWE that even Vince McMahon doesn't know about. But the whole thing, they're saying let it play out on social media. I believe even Mercury suggests that. He says, Hunter greenlit the whole thing. We don't shoot any of it. Let it play out on social media, and leads to a match with the Briscoes and Enzo and Cass. I find it funny, yes, it exposes a lot of Greg's deal, but it also exposes a lot of what Joey Mercury's thinking is too, because he's like, let it play out on social media, but yet social media is exactly the thing that killed it, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it was like total misreading of an audience, sort of like it was buzzworthy just because it was such a bad idea.
Yeah.
As opposed to being like buzzworthy, like, oh, these outsiders are coming in, so we really want to see what happens. And, not even to include the fact that you did it during this New Japan interpromotional match where they had no idea that these guys were coming out, and you heard a partnership, which seems, I think Koff described it as sort of informal anyway, which is very odd to have an informal relationship with New Japan. I'd imagine Penn has been to paper, as you've done so much co-promotion together, both here and in Japan. But even if that was the case, like, look at their relationship now. New Japan USA is going to run 30 shows a year, and the only talent that we really heard about from New Japan coming over was one of their younger talents in the UK, and Gilland had written, at least from that text message, that he was a waste of money. So look, this relationship that really carried them, which we didn't even talk about as an accelerant to the company's rise, has been killed off.
It's funny that you mentioned the New Japan Ring of Honor relationship, because if you go back to that Jim Cornette interview, he mentions, okay, now I wanted to bring in the Japanese talent. And the first guy that Cornette says that gave them any resistance to it was Greg Gilliland. He even back then, he goes, I won't concede that we can't draw this. I think the exact quote that Cornette said was, Greg said on the conference call, I won't concede that we can't draw this amount of people on our own, and that I'm not going to give any credit to these Japanese Kobashi and whatever the case. But it seems like Gilliland has always had a problem with bringing in those outside talent, and has always had a problem with it, and has always called them a waste of money, wouldn't you say?
It's interesting to see that point come out of him doing that. But as a numbers guy, as I imagine he is, like, it's very clear. And interestingly, New Japan had emailed me a couple of years ago, and they said, "Oh, we've come across your information, and we have some whatever statistics, or data you could share with us. Please do that." So it's like, okay, you don't get an email from New Japan every day. So I was like, okay, here you go. And I noted in there, as you can see, like, the spikes for Ring of Honor's attendance comes directly when they're co-promoting with you. So if I could see that, as an outsider and even share it with New Japan, which I'd imagine they would know, I'd imagine someone like Greg Gilliland would know that himself.
I want to talk a little bit. Do you have a couple more minutes to spend with me here? About 15 more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. I want to talk. We mentioned the back when Matt Taven won the title. That's kind of when, that year in New Orleans. That's kind of when things went to pot. A good friend of this channel, my buddy AC up in Connecticut, is going to kill me for saying this, but he was a lame duck champion. Nobody wanted it when it happened. Nobody saw it coming, and when it did happen, everybody's like, "Oh, him. Okay, this sucks," because nobody thought Taven was ready for this. And then you see this text message again. I'm going off Mercury's Twitter here. He says that is big picture thinking, like when I suggested 4 different times, and he has it circled and written 4 different times, that Marty goes up at the Garden. The reasoning was, we always strap the guy and then they leave, which Gilliland has a point to that. And I think coming off of this with the Young Bucks and everything, he saw the writing on the wall, is what Gilliland is saying here. So I'm not trying to paint Greg Gilliland in a positive light, but he does have some points here. If you go through and read these text messages from a level point of view, and then he goes, Gilliland goes, "Well, we knew Taven would stay, but we couldn't get him over." So it's almost as if they okay, we're going to put the belt on the guy that we know is not going to go anywhere, but we know that we can't get this guy over. It's almost like he's like, I'm going to go buy a gun and shoot myself in the foot, is what he's saying here. Would you agree?
So just to clarify a couple of points. So in New Orleans in 2018, I think that was sort of post-New Orleans. That's when things were sort of starting to go downhill. And then by 2019, WrestleMania weekend in Madison Square Garden, when Taven won the belt, that's really when things came off the rails. Although it's getting even worse now, so we could go lower. But I understand the idea of putting it on a champion that won't go anywhere. But you already had that. Jay Lethal. Yep. He was doing an amazing job of being a stable champion. If you had someone that you can give the accelerant to, and Marty Scurll had the buzz to him. I wasn't completely sold on him, but definitely live you could feel it. Like, fans are really into him. But if you wanted sort of that stable train to keep chugging along, having Jay Lethal retain the belt in Madison Square Garden would have been a much better story than Taven winning it. But also, Taven has something. For me, like having seen him live a number of times, he's very hateable, which is good for him. But you need someone else that would be likable to win the belt from or chase the belt. So just, and I'm not saying PCO would be the, who you strap the rocket to for years, being that he's about 51, but just talking about missed opportunity. When PCO went for the belt the first time in Toronto, although it's out of his primary market, because being French Canadian, they don't run Montreal, but in Toronto he was super over. It was a super hot match. What did they do the next time they returned to Toronto? he's not going for the belt. He's just in a tag team match. Now they're like, oh, we realized PCO would be a good person to win the belt. So now he's going for the final battle in Baltimore because they can't run New York anymore, and maybe he'll win it there. So it's sort of like this too little, too late, misdirected, missed opportunity. It didn't make sense, and they have to look at what's A plus B that equals C. I'm really a believer that they should get off the road, just do the minimal amount that they need to meet contractual obligations for television tapings, and get things right, and then start touring again. Why are you running St. Charles, Missouri in February in a 10,000 seat building? I know that they're not paying premium prices for it, I'm sure, but why, when you have no chance of selling more than 500 tickets right now?
Now, from their aspect, you're right. You don't have a chance of selling 500 tickets. And let me ask you this, because I'm not really up to speed on this. The St. Louis building that they're running, is it a TV taping or is it just a house show?
I'd have to take a look, but I was assuming it was a television taping. Otherwise, it would make no sense. I know that they've spoken about it before. There was a building in the greater Washington, D.C. area that was on a college campus. They're running in the summer, so it was sort of like, well, why are you doing this? Like, there's no students around. So Koff's answer was basically like, yeah, we weren't expecting to sell a great number of tickets, but they have the production facilities. We can string the lighting the way we want. It's not that expensive. So I can understand that when you're thinking about like Nashville Municipal Auditorium, it's it's not the first run arena there, and if it meets their needs, I could understand that, as long as you're going in with that perspective that you're not planning to sell more than a few hundred tickets, and you're not losing a ton of money every time outside the door. But I think if you can get maybe not an NWA studio, might not meet your needs as best as possible, but if you could get just focus on Atlanta and Las Vegas and maybe 2 other markets, and then just go to each every 2 months and just get the tapings done so you could figure things out, then you'd probably be saving a lot of money right now, which is sad to say because they were growing so much before.
I remember that, when UFC, I think it was, used to run the Hard Rock out there in Vegas. It was a smaller building. The Hard Rock, when they run that damn bar or casino, whatever it was out there, but it was intimate and it looked cool. I hate when they go to Vegas, when Ring of Honor goes to Vegas. That Sam's Town Casino, if anybody's ever been out there, I've never been out there, but I've seen pictures. That place is a crap hole, okay? It's probably, and I've heard people like Dave Scher and everybody else who's been to Vegas say it's not the best part of town either. They could maybe run like the Hard Rock. I'm not saying the Hard Rock is a good part of town because I've never been to Vegas, but it looks better than that Sam's Town Casino. They could maybe run a studio show every couple of weeks, or, I look at it, also as that they need to do something. Why are they running? They run the Cabreras Arena in Charlotte, North Carolina, with Concord, which is right outside of Charlotte. TNA ran that building for Bound for Glory one year when the whole delete thing with Matt Hardy and everything was real big. It was right before Matt Hardy left the company, I want to say. But you could take that building, tarp it in half, and have it hold a certain amount of people. Do you think that's what they do with this St. Louis, or do you think it's even a point in doing that when you say they're only going to draw 500 people anyway?
I think right now, from what I've seen with bigger buildings, they're getting smart, at least from first day on sales, where the building isn't spotty, where you can't buy like the third tier or something like that. They'll open up the floor, 5 to 7 rows on the floor, and if that sells, which it often doesn't now, they'll open up more, but they're not rigging the lighting for more than the floor. So I guess it just has to be for production purposes, unless they signed these contracts. I'd imagine for live events you have to sign it far ahead, but I can't imagine it was more than 18 months ahead, where we'll start seeing it catch up to the other, where they'll start doing much smaller arenas. But it doesn't. I think there's a better way. It just doesn't make sense. I would rather see it, like you mentioned, in a cool-looking small venue rather than something that's cavernous. That when your 400 fans go that actually like your product, what are they thinking? Like when they're there, it's sort of like, okay, I sort of like this, but am I missing the boat on something else? Why is there no one else here? That's sort of it's hard to grow a perception of something when the place is completely empty.
Do you think that they ought to be taking, it sounds like from what you were saying earlier, do you think they ought to be taking like an AEW approach where run your TVs, maybe do a pay-per-view every quarter, bring some fresh faces in, try to keep the ones from leaving, like Marty Scurll and everybody like that, which it sounds like Marty's already had one foot out the door because he signed his contract. He signs his contract, and then the Elite leaves, and now he can't be on being the Elite anymore. Sometimes he still is, but he's not really supposed to be being the Elite anymore. He can't do anything with the launch of AEW, but it kind of works out for AEW because that's a guy that everybody knows that they can bring in the future, like what we're seeing now. Do you think that they ought to be taking an AEW approach from how they handle their business?
I think an even more conservative approach where you say, okay, we have people sign the contract. Let's say they're guaranteed 40 dates a year. You either eat some of those dates and not use them, or you if you're able to with the contract, broker it out to local promotions, and then you cut some of the costs. Let's say you're guaranteeing someone $1,500 a date, which seeing some of the contract numbers, that's probably only the upper tier of talent. And if a local promoter wants to pay $900 for the person, so you take the loss there, and you say, how many shows can we tape over the weekend, over one or two venues, and just make those shows as good as you possibly can, and you hope 18 months later that you've built things back enough that you can go on the road and do things more regularly. But firstly, which I think they do, you have to think about serving the Sinclair master. What do they want on their television? And, how do you just keep things going? Because that's obviously the main revenue stream.
It seems like Sinclair, from a Sinclair point of view, and as a wrestling fan and a shareholder, you're probably going, no, don't do it. But it sounds like from a Sinclair point of view, they're only going to take so much bad publicity when it comes to this. I mean, this is Newsweek. It's not like it's the BFE News where, the greatest headline they've had in the last 5 years is a new traffic light. This is Newsweek. A lot of people read this. And then you have Mercury on Twitter giving out Greg Gilliland's email and phone number, which I'm assuming got changed very quickly. But it's not a good look for Ring of Honor. Then you got people under anonymity going into, Newsweek and saying, yeah, this is how it is. How much longer and how much more of this can happen before Sinclair just goes, okay, Ring of Honor, who wants it? The bid started $1 million. Let's go.
It's a great question because from for any other corporation, from a realistic perspective, you should definitely be exploring both of them. But Sinclair is very unique for a number of reasons. But one is that because of their own actions, one could have a different perspective, but because of their own actions, they're often under sort of a negative microscope. And, there's a story anyone can Google. One of their one of their news anchors at a local affiliate had cancer or has cancer, and she was fired, which, it's just an awful story. So if they can do that as a, huge corporation under one umbrella, so finding out that you're not treating a wrestler right who's concussed, is that worse? I think they're both horrible, so they can survive that. And the second thing is that it appears, and we often hear about this in wrestling, that there's a reason beyond sort of the dollars and cents. It's some people just have a passion for wrestling, and I think Sinclair likes having this original programming. You know, it makes up a small part of who they are, but even if you go to Sinclair's website, you know, it's not too hard to find Ring of Honor as one of the featured things, because besides news and now with sports, it'll be much more. But besides news, they produce very little original content. So they're very proud of the idea, maybe not the end product, but the idea of Ring of Honor, of having that under their umbrella. So it would make sense to sort of think about how much worse will this get before we just say forget it or we sell it. But there seems to be other reasons why it just works for Sinclair in their ecosystem.
You know, I'm on Sinclair Broadcasting Group's website, and from their front page, I don't see anything about Ring of Honor on here. I don't see Ring of Honor's, well, content creation, Ring of Honor, there you go. But it's not very, very prominent. Do you think that they're kind of like the redheaded stepchild, especially with them now acquiring all these regional sports networks? They have MLB contracts. They have the Tennis Channel. Maybe some, I don't know if NFL's in there or not. I don't have the article pulled up anymore. But do you think that Ring of Honor has now been categorized, or kind of always has been categorized, like the redheaded stepchild? Oh, that's just the wrestling that we bought.
I think their position is much greater than like WCW was with the Turner. Probably one of the important reasons, like I mentioned, it appears that, you know, the CEO, which it was a family business, he seems to like wrestling. And Joe Koff is a respected executive, from what I understand, in Sinclair. He does a number of things. If you look at his LinkedIn profile, he's not just focused on Ring of Honor, for better or worse.
Right.
So him championing it as value to the company, if he retires or moves on one day, that would be really interesting to see what they do with the product.
A couple more questions here, and we'll let you go. New Japan. I want to talk about New Japan because you do cover some New Japan on your Twitter as well. But do you kind of see New Japan going down the same rabbit hole as far as attendance goes? New Japan was a big part of that MSG sellout. From my perspective, I think that if at that point in time, if they would have branded it as New Japan only, they probably could have still sold it out. But do you think New Japan's kind of headed down the same rabbit hole as far as we're going to go in there, we're red hot and pop? They think they're red hot and popular, but Cody and the Bucks, again, it all goes back to those three guys, along with Omega and everybody else with the Elite, Hangman Page and all them. And do you think that AEW has just crippled the independent? Because there was a time where independent wrestling and New Japan and Ring of Honor, that was the thing to watch. Was you had pop-up sites like Powerbomb.tv, which is now another name, and all this, and now it's kind of died down. It's kind of like, okay, the fad is over almost. Do you see New Japan going down the same rabbit hole as far as running bigger buildings and not selling them out, not being able to keep talent happy? God forbid they don't have a wellness policy, especially with that style of wrestling. Do you think they're going to go down the same rabbit hole?
So I think New Japan US is very interesting. So I've never attempted to sort of understand New Japan in Japan, just because it seems so complex. I like to read about people that are sort of experts and willing to tackle that. But New Japan in the US is something that I follow really closely. So I think for them, they were the buzz. So we have to go back a few years. So before sort of New Japan emerged as a player in the U.S., they actually were like, hey, we could do some tours here. Let's not do it ourselves. Let's find a promoter. So they found someone named Fat Frank, who was with Jersey All Pro.
Yeah.
And basically Jersey All Pro lost a ton of money because of trying to promote the New Japan, because they were just like, it was like just a small venue in New Jersey, an indie venue, and those sort of shows. And they did do well. Jersey All Pro actually, years later transitioned into GCW, which is a hot indie right now.
Yep.
But then they connected with Ring of Honor, and they were the accelerants together, where it helped Ring of Honor succeed and helped New Japan get greater visibility. And then New Japan got on Access, and they helped together. They were partners in helping Access to grow. Access was one of the only cable stations that actually grew its distribution traditionally, whereas most cable stations lost it, and now they're distributed in 50 million homes. And then when I think it was a lost opportunity because New Japan didn't capitalize when they were as hot as they were in the market, where it took them a while to tour here. And then once they did really well with their first shows. But right now, I think they're playing it well in that they're realizing we can't do, let's say, 3 big major arena shows, but we can run regionally. So they're very specific about it. They're like, there's 3. They had this on their English website. They're like, there's 3 or 4 regions, and we're going to run those X amount of times a year. So, for example, they ran the Northeast regionally recently and regionally, whereas the markets that they would run with Ring of Honor, so the Hammerstein, Lowell Memorial Auditorium, I think it was the ECW Arena, those sort of places. And Lowell is a bigger building, so that didn't sell out, but it did better than any show Ring of Honor has ever done in that building, which has done well, meaning from Ring of Honor had peaked out in 1900, and New Japan did 2300, something like that. Of course, they sold out ECW Arena, and Hammerstein they sold out right away, faster than any Ring of Honor show I've seen. So from a sort of a small arena, or concert type venue type space, it seems pretty solid. I think they have a solid base of support, but they had the opportunity to be somewhat of what AEW was. I think for some fans, they could sort of look past a non-American promotion, and some people love that it's sort of like an international brand. But I think it would be hard to be AEW in itself, just because they would never be I was going to say America First promotion, but that's circling back to the beginning of our conversation. That's a whole other phrase these days.
Right.
But an American First promotion, if you were to sort of have that buzzwordiness. So I think they'll be okay. I think they're being conservative about it, 30 shows, but probably because they missed the opportunity, where they are now, they'll be solid. However, again, I don't think TV is the most important thing right now for drawing fans, but with Anthem, the owners of Impact buying Access, their continued appearance on Access seems very shaky, as their producers were fired from Access, the people that produced the show, and it's been preempted a couple of weeks in a row. So it makes one think, is this really going to be on here anymore?
I think it's funny how they kind of took the partnership of Ring of Honor, and then Cody and them left and started AEW. And they're like, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to completely kind of, officially the partnership is not severed, but it's kind of like, okay, we saw where Ring of Honor was drawing with our talent the most, like Charlotte, Atlanta, New York, Ohio, I wouldn't be, and like you said, I saw that little map like you were talking about, the little territory map where they're going to run. And when it said the South, I'm like, okay, they're going to run Charlotte and Atlanta, and that's it. Maybe Florida, which I doubt because that's AEW's backyard. But it's kind of like they learned from Ring of Honor. They took whatever they took what Ring of Honor taught them, and then they're brushing Ring of Honor aside, which now would probably be a good time to go ahead and sever the partnership, given all the publicity going around. I can't say people would blame them. The timing is right, but it's kind of like they took what Ring of Honor taught them and are now putting it to use there, but better. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think the timing, like, it was something that every year everyone would sort of be looking at it and be like, oh, this New Japan tour, we think about it, was really successful. And when you look at the numbers, it was New Japan. So when are they going to start doing their own thing more? And it'd be year to year. And then suddenly, whatever the last co-promotional tour was that didn't draw well at all, it was like, okay, the timing is right now. And here, it's no surprise that New Japan is going to do their own thing.
Well, Lavie, I said we were going to go 15 minutes. We've gone 22. So we are recording this Sunday night, folks. So we've all got jobs to do and everything, I'm sure. So we're going to leave it there. I would love to have you on again in another 6 months because I could keep going on with you as far as the state of Ring of Honor and New Japan and just the whole aspects of it. Like I said, your Twitter account intrigues me the more and more I read it every day. And I always look forward to seeing those tweets pop up on my feed. But if you'd like to, go ahead and take this time, a little bit of time here, and if you want to tell people where they can find you on social media, and I'm going to put a link to the book, TrumpMania. It's an interesting read, folks. I really, really highly recommend it. But go ahead and tell everybody where they can find you on social media, and if you have anything else besides the podcast coming up, let them know about it.
Sure. So on Twitter, that's probably the best place to point all directions, at Lavie Marg, LavieMarg. If you want to see some of my articles that are both wrestling business related, and if you're looking for some career advice too, LionCubJobSearch.com. And if you want to check out TrumpMania, just go to Amazon, any Amazon, no matter where you live, and search TrumpMania, and the book will come out.
Lavie, thank you so much for joining us. Stay on the line with me here as... folks, we're going to be coming right back. I'm going to give you my wrestler of the decade, and it might surprise you. Stay with me.